Have you ever wondered why someone can lose a person who truly loved them, and only realize it when it is already too late? Not just any love, but the kind of love that stays, the kind of love that forgives, the kind of love that chooses you again and again, even when you don't choose it back. And still, somehow, it gets pushed away. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this truth, something most people avoid thinking about, because it forces us to look at human behavior in a very raw way. It is easy to assume that love is always recognized in real time, that when someone cares deeply, it is always felt and valued instantly. But psychology tells a very different story, especially when it comes to people who are emotionally avoidant. Because for them, love is not always experienced as comfort. Sometimes it is experienced as pressure. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because closeness itself activates something internal. A feeling of being seen too deeply, a fear of dependence, a fear of losing control over their own emotional space. And so instead of leaning in, they step back. At first, it doesn't even look like a big decision. It rarely does. It starts small. A delayed reply, a quiet withdrawal, a need for more space, a sudden emotional distance that cannot easily be explained. And to the outside world, it may even look logical. It may even look healthy. But inside, something different is happening. There is a psychological defense mechanism at play. When emotional intensity rises, the avoidant mind doesn't always process it as love. It processes it as danger. Not danger in a physical sense, but emotional danger. The risk of being needed too much, the risk of being trapped, the risk of losing independence. So instead of moving closer to love, the instinct is to reduce closeness in order to feel safe again. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because the person on the other side is not asking for control. They are not demanding ownership. They are simply offering connection, real connection, the kind that builds slowly, deeply, and honestly. But avoidant patterns do not always distinguish between healthy closeness and emotional pressure. The nervous system reacts first and logic follows later. So they begin to detach. And in that detachment, something very strange happens internally. There is relief, a temporary sense of freedom, a feeling of space returning. The emotional weight feels lighter. And in that moment, the mind creates a story. This is better. I am fine now. I needed this. But what is not understood in that moment is that emotional suppression is not the same as emotional resolution. Just because something feels lighter does not mean it is healed. It often just means it has been pushed down. This is the first stage of a much deeper psychological cycle. A cycle where avoidance feels like peace at first, where distance feels like clarity, where walking away feels like self-protection. But underneath it all, emotional attachment does not disappear. It simply goes quiet for a while. And this is where life begins to shift in a subtle but powerful way. Because the person who is truly loving does not always stay in the same place emotionally. Real love has a limit when it is not received. Real care eventually meets self-respect. And slowly, quietly, without drama, they begin to pull away. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, out of emotional imbalance, out of the realization that love cannot survive alone. And this is the moment everything changes, even if it is not immediately understood. Because when that person leaves, it does not feel like loss at first. It often feels like continuation of the same emotional distance that was already created. The avoidant mind interprets it as just another step in the same direction. More space, more silence, more independence, more. But what is not realized yet is that this is not just distance anymore. This is absence. And absence has a different psychological weight. It does not ask for attention. It does not create pressure. It simply removes presence. And presence is something the brain adapts to slowly over time. It becomes familiar. It becomes part of emotional reality. Until suddenly, it is gone. But the mind does not register loss immediately when avoidance is involved. Instead, it delays emotional processing. It keeps functioning as if nothing major has changed. It continues the routine. It continues the distraction. It continues the illusion of being okay. But deep inside, something has already shifted. And the strange part is, the realization of what was lost does not come in the moment of separation. It comes in silence. It comes later. It comes in unexpected waves. And it always starts the same way, not with pain, but with emptiness. And that emptiness is where the real story begins. Why does silence feel louder after someone is truly gone, even when you were the one who created the distance in the first place? This is where the psychology of emotional avoidance becomes more complex than it first appears. Because what looked like peace was never peace at all, it was delay, a pause in emotional processing, a temporary shutdown of deeper feeling systems. And when the external presence disappears completely, the internal system finally begins to react. At first, the absence does not feel emotional. It feels neutral. Life continues in the same rhythm. The mind stays busy with routine, distractions, and logic-based thinking. Everything seems stable on the surface. This is because avoidant patterns often rely on intellectual control to override emotional signals. If something is not acknowledged, it feels like it is not there. But the human mind does not erase emotional bonds just because they are ignored. It stores them quietly in memory and body response. And over time, those stored emotional imprints begin to resurface when the external noise reduces. This is where the shift begins. It often starts in the smallest ways. A random moment of stillness that feels heavier than usual. A brief pause in the middle of the day where nothing feels engaging. A strange discomfort that cannot be clearly named. There is no obvious sadness yet, but there is a growing internal emptiness that was not present before. Psychologically, this happens because emotional attachment does not end when contact ends. It fades only when it is fully processed. And avoidant coping patterns often interrupt that processing. So the emotional system remains unfinished, like a thought that was never completed. As time passes, the brain begins to search for familiar emotional references. It naturally tries to reconnect with patterns that once created comfort. This is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic response from the attachment system. The mind starts retrieving fragments of interaction, not in full clarity, but in emotional flashes. A simple memory of a conversation, a repeated phrase, a specific tone in voice. Even ordinary moments begin to return with unexpected emotional weight. And what makes this more powerful is that these memories were never valued fully at the time they were happening. There is also a deeper psychological contradiction forming internally. On one side, there is the identity that was built around independence, the belief that emotional distance equals strength, the belief that self-reliance means no need for attachment. On the other side, there is a growing internal recognition that connection was not weakness, but regulation. This conflict creates discomfort that is difficult to explain, because it is not just emotional pain, it is a challenge to self-perception. The mind begins to question earlier decisions, but without directly confronting them. Instead, it manifests as restlessness, irritability, or a lack of emotional satisfaction in daily life. New interactions may begin to feel different as well, not because they are objectively worse, but because they lack emotional depth that was once available. There is a subtle comparison happening in the background of the mind, not intentional, but automatic. Every new interaction is measured against a memory that was not fully appreciated in its time, and in most cases, nothing matches that internal reference point. This is where regret starts to form, but not in an obvious emotional explosion. It begins as recognition without acceptance, a quiet awareness that something meaningful was overlooked, yet the ego still tries to protect the original narrative. It tries to maintain the idea that the decision to create distance was necessary. So two internal forces begin to operate at the same time. One tries to justify the past, the other quietly questions it. This dual process creates mental fatigue, a sense of internal disconnection that does not have a clear source. Over time, emotional suppression becomes harder to maintain. The system that once blocked emotional intensity begins to weaken. This is not sudden, it is gradual. The mind can no longer fully hold back what was never resolved, and when emotional material is delayed instead of processed, it often returns with increased strength. This is why moments of quiet become uncomfortable, not because silence is empty, but because silence allows what was avoided to surface. The absence of external distraction removes the barrier that was holding emotional awareness back. At this stage, even simple reminders can trigger emotional responses. Places that were once shared in thought, objects that were once ordinary, situations that resemble past experiences in small ways. Each one acts like a signal, reconnecting the mind to something that was emotionally significant. And the most difficult realization begins to form slowly. It is not about missing someone in a romantic sense alone. It is about recognizing emotional value after it has already been removed from daily life. The understanding that what was once taken for granted had a deeper importance than it seemed at the time. But acceptance does not arrive immediately with this awareness. Instead, resistance appears first. The mind tries to reduce the importance of what is being felt. It attempts to categorize it as temporary, as confusion, as overthinking. Yet the emotional system continues to grow stronger underneath that resistance. This internal struggle becomes more visible in private moments. When there is no external validation, no social distraction, no structured activity to occupy attention. In those moments, emotional truth becomes harder to ignore, not because it is new, but because it is finally unfiltered. And this is where the true weight of loss begins to take shape. Not in the moment of separation, but in the realization that emotional presence had already become part of internal stability. It was not just another connection. It was something the system had adapted to without conscious awareness. Once that realization starts to settle, everything that follows begins to shift the internal landscape, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. What happens when the mind finally stops running from what it feels and is forced to sit with what it avoided for too long? This is the stage where emotional reality begins to break through the surface that was carefully maintained for so long, not through dramatic breakdown, but through gradual awareness that cannot be ignored anymore. The system that once relied on distance and distraction starts to lose its effectiveness. At this point, the emotional state is no longer neutral. It begins to carry weight. Not in a sudden wave, but in a slow accumulation of awareness that something important is missing from internal life. The absence that once felt like space now starts to feel like unfinished emotional business. One of the strongest shifts happens in attention. The mind starts focusing on details that were previously irrelevant. Small patterns that were never noticed before now become meaningful. Everyday moments begin to feel slightly incomplete, as if something familiar is missing from the structure of experience. This is not random. It is how attachment systems behave when they are no longer suppressed. The brain naturally attempts to restore emotional balance by revisiting stored connection points. It does not do this through logic, it does it through feeling-based recall. As this process continues, emotional contrast becomes more visible. There is a growing difference between external interactions and internal memory. Present experiences start to feel emotionally thinner, while past connection carries unexpected depth. This contrast creates an internal imbalance that is difficult to ignore. The mind begins to search for explanations. It tries to understand why certain moments now feel heavier than before, why thoughts appear without invitation, why certain emotional states rise without clear triggers. This search for reasoning creates mental tension because the answer is not intellectual. It is emotional realization. At the same time, a subtle shift occurs in self-reflection. Past decisions begin to replay, not as complete memories, but as fragmented impressions. Specific emotional responses are remembered more clearly than events themselves. The feeling of withdrawal, the moments of detachment, the internal sense of wanting space without fully understanding its cost. This is where internal contradiction intensifies. The identity built around emotional independence starts to conflict with the emerging awareness of emotional need. One part of the mind still values distance as protection. Another part begins to recognize that distance also removes something essential. This conflict does not resolve quickly. Instead, it creates cycles of thought that repeat in different forms. Questions appear indirectly, not in full sentences, but as emotional pressure points. What was actually being protected? What was unintentionally lost? Was the sense of control worth the emotional emptiness that followed? As this internal questioning deepens, emotional memory becomes more active. The mind does not only recall events, it reconstructs emotional meaning attached to those events. Moments that once felt ordinary now carry significance that was not recognized at the time. There is also a growing sensitivity to comparison. New experiences, even if positive, do not create the same internal response. Something feels absent in them, not because they lack value, but because they lack emotional depth that the system once experienced and did not fully acknowledge. This creates a quiet form of dissatisfaction, not loud or expressive, but internal and consistent, a feeling that something essential is no longer accessible in the same way. And the more the mind tries to replace it, the more noticeable the difference becomes. During this phase, emotional defense mechanisms begin to weaken. The tendency to rationalize past choices becomes less effective. Logic no longer fully contains emotional response. What was once controlled through reasoning starts to surface through feeling. This is where emotional honesty begins to emerge, even if it is uncomfortable. There is a recognition that the previous distance was not just a preference, it was a reaction. And that reaction had consequences that were not fully understood in real time. The emotional system now begins to process what was delayed. And delayed processing often feels more intense than immediate experience, because it is not just about the present feeling. It includes accumulated emotional weight from all the moments that were not fully experienced when they occurred. This is why certain quiet moments feel heavier than expected. Without external stimulation, the mind has space to process what was previously pushed aside. And in that space, emotional clarity begins to form slowly, without force. There is also a growing awareness that some connections do not remain available indefinitely. Not all emotional bonds wait to be revisited. Some move forward, change direction, or close completely. This understanding creates a subtle emotional pressure that was not present before. It is not simply about missing someone. It is about recognizing the value of what was present only after it has fully transitioned into memory. And memory does not respond the same way as presence. It cannot be interacted with. It can only be experienced internally. As this realization strengthens, emotional perception changes. The past is no longer viewed through neutral recall. It becomes emotionally charged, not exaggerated but clearer in meaning. What was once overlooked now stands out with quiet clarity. And in this clarity, a deeper understanding starts to develop. Emotional avoidance does not remove attachment. It only postpones recognition of it. What was once delayed does not disappear. It returns in a different form, shaped by time and distance. This stage marks a turning point in internal awareness, because once emotional truth is no longer filtered through avoidance, it begins to reshape how past experiences are understood, not to create regret alone, but to create awareness that changes how future emotional connections will be perceived. And from here, the internal journey moves into a more reflective state, where understanding begins to replace resistance slowly and steadily. What happens when inner resistance finally weakens, and a person can no longer deny the emotional truth that has been building quietly for so long? This is where awareness turns deeper, because the mind is no longer simply reacting to absence. It is beginning to understand its meaning. The earlier confusion starts to settle into something clearer, not easier, but more honest. Emotional distance, once seen as protection, now starts revealing its hidden cost. At this stage, the internal experience changes direction. Instead of focusing outward on distraction or justification, attention slowly turns inward. This shift is subtle but powerful. It is not forced. It happens naturally when external noise no longer dominates mental space. The most noticeable change is the return of emotional sensitivity. Things that once felt neutral begin to carry feeling again, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way that follows thoughts throughout the day. It becomes harder to fully disconnect from what is being felt. There is also a growing awareness of contrast between past emotional engagement and present emptiness. The mind starts recognizing that certain moments had more depth than they were given credit for, not because they were perfect, but because they carried emotional authenticity that is now missing from current experience. This realization does not come as a single thought. It builds gradually through repeated reflection. Each memory adds another layer of understanding. Each internal comparison strengthens the sense that something meaningful was not fully acknowledged when it was available. As this awareness develops, emotional interpretation of the past begins to change. Earlier, decisions were framed as necessary or logical. Now those same decisions begin to feel incomplete in understanding, not necessarily wrong in intention, but limited in awareness of emotional consequence. This is where internal discomfort becomes more complex. It is no longer just about missing someone. It becomes about understanding personal emotional patterns, the tendency to withdraw when things became intense, the habit of prioritizing space over connection, the instinct to reduce emotional closeness when vulnerability increased. These patterns now appear differently under reflection. What once felt like control now feels like avoidance of depth. What once felt like independence now feels like emotional interruption. This shift in perception is not immediate. It develops through repeated self-observation. At the same time, emotional recall becomes more vivid. The mind does not only remember events, it re-experiences emotional tone. Small details become significant again. The feeling of being understood in rare moments. The comfort that was present without being demanded. The stability that was taken for granted. This type of recollection is not nostalgic in a simple sense. It carries emotional weight because it is linked to awareness of loss. Not loss in a dramatic form, but loss in recognition of value after separation has already occurred. During this phase, inner dialogue becomes more frequent. The mind revisits past situations with new interpretation. Conversations are replayed with different understanding. Actions are re-evaluated from a perspective that did not exist at the time they happened. This creates a layered experience of reflection. One layer holds memory, another holds current understanding. The difference between the two produces emotional tension because perception has evolved while the past remains fixed. As this continues, the idea of emotional safety begins to shift. Earlier, safety was associated with distance. Now distance begins to feel less like safety and more like absence of connection. This reversal does not happen suddenly. It is a gradual change in emotional interpretation. There is also a deeper recognition forming around emotional reciprocity, the understanding that connection requires mutual presence, not just emotional availability from one side. When that balance is disrupted for too long, even strong emotional bonds begin to weaken over time. This awareness introduces a quiet form of regret, not expressed outwardly, but experienced internally as reflection. It is not about wanting to change the past. It is about fully seeing what was not fully seen before. That clarity itself becomes emotionally significant. At this point, emotional processing becomes more integrated. The mind is no longer resisting memory or feeling. Instead, it is attempting to make sense of them together. This integration creates moments of clarity followed by moments of heaviness, as understanding deepens. Another important shift occurs in self-perception. The identity built around emotional detachment begins to feel less stable. It becomes clear that emotional suppression was not absence of feeling, but interruption of it. This realization challenges long-held assumptions about strength and control. With this comes a new form of emotional awareness, not reactive awareness, but reflective awareness. The ability to see past patterns without immediately defending them. The ability to observe emotional behavior without denying its consequences. As this develops, the emotional system begins to reorganize itself. What was once pushed away starts to be acknowledged internally, not to reopen pain, but to complete processing that was previously left unfinished. This stage is not about returning to the past. It is about understanding it fully for the first time, and that understanding changes how emotional experiences are valued moving forward. Because once the mind recognizes the depth of what was once overlooked, future emotional decisions are no longer made from the same place. They are shaped by awareness that has been earned through reflection, silence, and emotional consequence.